So good morning and good afternoon, depending on where you're joining us from. I'm Bhavna Prasad. I'm the Director of Sustainable Business at WWF India. We'd like to welcome everyone to the launch of the Renewable, or rather Responsible Energy Initiative, a call to action report. We're all aware of the tremendous contribution the renewable energy sector is making and will continue to make in the future to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees centigrade and ultimately avoid the catastrophic impacts of climate change. The growing demand for renewable energy and the scale it is achieving is also opening up conversations on the unintended environmental and social consequences of the RE sector. These are important and preemptive discussions for the sector to have in order to adopt a holistic approach to generate long-term value for society and shareholders. India, with its ambitious RE targets, is not only shaping the global RE low-carbon future, but also the RE value chain. We believe that India can also lead the way in this energy transition towards clean and responsible energy. The report we are launching today highlights some of the environmental and social impacts of the RE sector in India and the extent to which these impacts are currently being governed, managed, and mitigated. The purpose of this report is to provide a consolidated snapshot of the sector landscape in a way that helps accelerate collective action. This report is a part of the Responsible Energy Initiative, which is also supporting the access or the success of the RE sector and enabling a more holistic understanding, as I mentioned earlier, of the broader environmental and social issues so that we can work collaboratively to initiate this journey. This is a joint effort between World Resources Institute, Forum for the Future, TERI, Landesa, and WWF. We invite the larger RE sector to work collaboratively with us. We'll tell you more about how to do that in this session later today. We'd also like to thank the organizations that have supported us with their funding: UK Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office, FCDO, and S&P Global Foundation. Now, moving on to the session agenda today, we have an hour-and-a-half session starting with the opening address. There's a report launch that will be followed by the keynote address, panel discussion, and finally closing remarks. Just wanted to highlight a few quick technology protocols that I guess most of you are already aware of now. Nonetheless, the session today will be rich with insights and perspectives. The panel discussion will offer an opportunity to ask questions to the panelists. Please type your questions in the Q&A option for Zoom. In case you're not able to answer them, in case we are not able to answer them, we will try and get back with our answers offline. If you need any help with Zoom, please ask the team through the chat function. We will try and resolve your query. It gives me great pleasure to introduce Mr. Gavin McElvery to give his special address. Gavin has been the head of the UK FCDO in India since June 2017. He was previously head of DFID's office in Burma since June 2013. And before that, he was based in DFID's London office, where he headed DFID's private sector department, Global Funds and Developmental Financial Institutions Department, and the International Financial Institutions Department. Welcome, Gavin, to the event. I would like to request you to deliver the opening address. On to you.
Well, thank you, and thank you for your welcoming and informative opening remarks. And I should say I'm really pleased and proud to be associated with this report. This strikes me as being a report that is both important and timely. Now, all of us, I should imagine, all of us on this call today are participants in the renewable energy sector. And I think maybe we've all got a bit smug thinking, what about a wonderful work we're doing? We sort of go around with a bit of a halo, we're the good guys, we're doing renewable energy. There's an interesting quote in the executive summary of the report from the Indian Renewable Energy Development Agency, IREDA, which notes in its annual report that it views renewable energy projects as the most environmentally benign and socially acceptable projects. Well, this report that we're launching today is a bit of a wake-up call, I think, to all of us, and it reminds us, or it reminded me, that any sector can have unintended impacts and unintended consequences. And the report looks at the potentially negative impacts that the operation of renewable energy can have to land, water, flora, fauna, and perhaps most importantly, the communities. But it goes beyond that. Very interestingly, I think, it looks back to where the materials used in the renewable energy sector are sourced from, and it looks forward to where the disposal of the materials used in the sector and the potential for harm at both ends of the supply chain. So it points out that the renewable energy sector can have damaging consequences to others through its own operations, through its supply chain, through its disposal. But it also, interestingly, points out that it can be a danger to itself in that increasingly the funders of the sector are concerned about the environmental, social, and governance impacts of the sector. And we saw a snapshot of that a couple of months ago. There was that report in January in the New York Times about the use of forced labor in the production of solar panels. And that had investors across the world worrying. We, the FCDO, both directly and through CDC, were a significant investor in the renewable energy sector in India. Importantly through IANA and through the Green Growth Equity Fund. And I note that one of my colleagues from the management company of the Green Growth Equity Fund will be one of your panelists later on. But that report in the New York Times certainly had us scurrying around, worrying whether we had invested or were investing in a sector that wasn't looking properly at where it sourced its materials. And I should say that we were comforted, but we were worried. So the report points us to what is in a way obvious, that we need to identify possible negative impacts. We want to avoid negative impacts, both for the good of the world and also for the good of the sector. And the report's timely because the renewable energy sector, although we're all excited by its growth, it is still quite young. It is still relatively small. And compared to how it will be in 10 years' time, when it will be the dominant power source in most countries of the world, if we can nip in the bud now, if we can change the practices of the sector so that it avoids negative consequences, then we'll save ourselves a lot of bother 10 years down the road when the sector is several times larger than it is at the moment. And I like the way the report focuses on the various governance frameworks that affect the functioning of different parts of the renewable energy sector, or as the report points out, does not affect, because it points out that there are elements of the whole sector from the sourcing to the disposal that really seem to not be covered adequately by governance frameworks. So I hope today, unfortunately, I'm not going to be able to stay for the whole of the session because I've got a prior commitment, but today we've gathered together some of the world experts in the sector, some of the finest practitioners. And I do hope that you will, between you, be able to identify concrete next steps. We've got the report on paper. How do we turn the the ideas, the insights in the report into concrete actions. And I'm going to take the horrible and probably dangerous liberty as a complete amateur of just remarking on 2 points that the report doesn't dwell on, and expanding on one that it does. And one point that at least in the executive summary, I didn't see much on was the role of technology. And I will be interested to see if in the discussions this afternoon, people talk about the role of technology in reducing or avoiding the negative impact of the sector. Well, just one example, one thing, the FCDO, we back a number of incubators, and one of them is a startup incubator in IIT Kanpur. And one of the startups that we back has produced a commercially viable waterless cleaner of solar panels. It looks like a giant crab, and you attach it to one end of solar panels. It scuttles along, cleaning the panels without using any water. So an example of using technology to avoid depletion of groundwater. But I think also thinking about the use of digital technology to track the sourcing of materials, to track the disposal of materials. Maybe there are opportunities there. And then another aspect that people might want to think of is the role of users. The users of electricity. Electricity is an infrastructure service, and last week we had the international conference for the Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure, and Prime Minister Modi addressed that conference, as did Dr. R.K. Mishra, his principal secretary. And I was really struck in both of their addresses by the focus they had on the users of infrastructure services and the importance of users in the equitable and sustainable operation of infrastructure. It's not, I suppose, straightforward to see that role in the electricity sector, but I mean, if you look at the importance of consumers of, say, clothing and the impact that has on practice in the textile sector, I do wonder whether electricity distribution companies that can assure their users that the electricity they are providing has been sustainably and responsibly sourced will begin to gain a bit of competitive advantage in the future. And the last point that I wanted to make, which was the report talks about the opportunities of forming an alliance of countries to reduce negative impact from the supply chain and contribute to the sustainable growth of the sector. And that strikes me as an interesting area of opportunity. And you will shortly be hearing the wise words of my friend and colleague, Dr. Ejim Mathur, in his new role as Director General of the International Solar Alliance. I'm sure he will be wise to this opportunity. And the International Solar Alliance has already done great work in using alliances of countries to drive down the cost of solar panels to countries, and there may well be a role for the International Solar Alliance in bringing together countries to, one, disseminate responsible practice in the sector, and two, to put a pressure on sources of supply to do so responsibly. Fascinating. What a great topic for us all to be discussing this afternoon. So congratulations to the authors of the report, congratulations to the sponsors, and I wish you well in this afternoon's discussions. Thank you.
Thank you, Gavin, for sharing your beautiful thoughts, especially highlighting the possible role of technologies and focus on users of the electricity infra. So we're delighted to have with us Dr. Ajay Mathur. I'm sure Dr. Mathur needs no introduction, but still I would like to quickly say a few lines for him. Dr. Mathur has recently joined us the International Solar Alliance as his Director General. Prior to that, joining ISA, Dr. Mathur was the Director General of JD, and I've worked very closely with him as my boss. Dr. Mathur earlier headed the Indian Bureau of Energy Efficiency and was responsible for his foundational programs, which mainstreamed energy efficiency through initiatives such as the Star Leveling Program for appliances, the Energy Conservation Building Code, and the Perform, Achieve, and Trade Program, among many other initiatives that he has taken. He is also the member of the Prime Minister's Council on Climate Change. Welcome, Dr. Mathur. It is a pleasure to have you and Gavin launch the report. I'd now like to request Gavin and Dr. Mathur to hold the hard copies of the report together on your video and say, we are glad to launch the report, Renewable Energy to Responsible Energy, a call for action. Please allow 30 minutes so that we can take a screenshot of the launch.
Gavin, we are pleased, aren't we? We are pleased to release the report.
Thank you. Thank you, Gavin and Dr. Mathur. I'd like to inform everyone that the report is now live on our websites and ready to be downloaded. We'll share the link to the webpage towards the end of the launch event in the chat box. And you will also get a mail after the event. I'd now like to invite Dr. Mathur to deliver the keynote address. Sir.
Thank you very much, Debajit. I'm absolutely delighted to follow Mr. McGillivray in talking about this report and about the kinds of issues that it represents. I also want to thank Bhavna and WWF for this opportunity, which has brought us all together. Obviously, as was mentioned, the World Resources Institute Forum for the Future, Landesa have been partners, and I'm very grateful to the UK government, the FID or the FCDO now, and the Standard & Poor Global Foundation for the support. As we move ahead, I obviously echo Gavin's point that we are at a stage in history where solar is, or renewables in general, are now about to, and in many geographies have already become the energy option of preference. We have seen over the past 5 years, and I don't want to go further, but in the past 5 years since the Paris Agreement, we have seen, for example, that the amount of variable renewables, wind and solar, in the Indian system, the capacity has grown from something of the order of approximately 8 or 9% to something of the order of about 20-25%. But the amount of electricity has also increased from less than 5% to about 11%. At the same time, and this is what is leading to the transition, is that the prices of electricity from renewable energy have dropped to the point where a kilowatt hour of electricity from solar, when the sun is shining, is as low as 1.99 rupees per kilowatt hour. The challenge, of course, is that we need to ensure that round-the-clock electricity from renewables is available, particularly at times when we have the peak demand at night, when the sun is not shining. And this means that we need to build in storage. And in this part of the world, there'll be some storage that will be provided by hydro and pumped hydro, but largely by batteries. Now, the challenge, of course, this brings is that, yes, solar plus batteries will very soon be the cheapest form of electricity in the country. That will be great because that does mean no CO2 emissions. But with a huge amount of solar panels and batteries that are spread all over the country, we do face a huge amount of challenge. That's what this report brings out. We are at a stage, however, when this large growth can be nudged towards becoming not a problem to society, but actually providing a new way of reusing the resources so that we are better off than we were with the old fossil fuel-based jet technologies. This, however, means, and the report clearly brings out that if we don't do this, we face a future in which we would need to mitigate ecological and social vulnerabilities, which are increased, particularly because of the use of renewable energy. We will see that the further erosion of labor and human rights, particularly due to raw material extraction and its mining. We would need to preserve and strengthen local and regional biodiversity, else it will be trampled on the ground on which renewables are set up. Water-related issues will become important, and therefore we would need to address those. And particularly around project site areas, there will be issues of energy justice. And here I'm not just talking of fossil fuels, I'm talking about renewable energy. But as I said, we are at a point in history where we can make an effective nudge towards ensuring that we don't just focus on renewable energy, but on responsible energy. Gavin just spoke about how these kinds of issues would need to be brought into the public perception and the importance of technology. I would like to emphasize that as we move ahead, both of these are important. For example, we would start seeing batteries and solar panels spread all over the country. And when they stop working, what do? Do they go to a landfill? Imagine how many landfills would we need. We can't find a space for another landfill in Delhi. In other words, we would need to make sure that we collect the solar panels and batteries that have lived out their lives, but not only collect them, but recycle them, get the materials out of them and reuse them in the new batteries and new panels that are made. But this means that today we will need to specify how those materials are put in place, in a sense so that they're dismantleable. Because if you can't separate out the materials, there's no point of recycling. There's no way that you can recycle them. Therefore, today, we would need things like the kind of specifications so as to enable the recycling to occur at the end of life. All of these are important. Yet, we do face the issue, as the report says, and as Gavin just pointed out, that these are produced in different countries. There is a supply cycle to these, and this spans multiple countries. In other words, even if you do everything you want in one country, the externalities very well exist in other countries. If the externalities occur in other countries, then we face the issue that if an upstream country from the supply point of view does not take care, then they produce things at lower costs. For example, if recyclable solar panels are made by some countries, but they cost more, and non-recyclable panels are made by other countries, but they cost less, there is a huge debate, there's a huge perception, there is a huge pressure on users to use the lower cost and non-recyclable panels. This is where public perception comes in. My short point is both technology and public perception are needed. I think that to do this, as Gavin pointed out, we would need an alliance of countries. The International Solar Alliance, which I am amazingly proud to head now, provides us with one opportunity to bring together countries on these issues, to build both the public perceptions on the one side and the specifications for batteries and panels so that they're recyclable on the other side. Together, I think the alliance can play a role in influencing countries in seeing how we can go ahead with implementing these. But while the alliance can present these, while the alliance can make a political case, it is up to civil society to ensure that, number one, a debate occurs. Number two, we look at the kinds of concerns that are looked at. Because, in different countries, there'll be other issues. For a country which is a large producer of solar panels, the issue will be following the specifications. For a country which is a large user of solar panels, the issue will be setting up the collection mechanisms and possibly the recycling plants. So there will be priorities of what comes first, what comes later. Public debate will help us move in this. Public debate will help us identify the kinds of political processes that are needed to bring these on to the public agenda. I hope that with this report, we are able to move in that direction and convert renewable energy from just being renewable to also being responsible. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mathur, for those inspiring words and always pushing India's ambition. Thank you once again, Gavin and Dr. Mathur, for launching the report and the addresses. We now have the presentation by the forum team on the report. So either you can stay back and hear the presentation and then leave this one as per your convenience. Requesting all the audience to stay on to listen not just the key insights from the report, but also for the panel discussion. And I'd now like to invite the team from the forum Forum for Future to share the key findings from the report. Over to you, Anna.
Thank you, Devajit. And thank you, Gavin and Dr. Mathur, and thank you, Bhavna. As Devajit says, I and my two Forum for the Future colleagues, Hansika Singh and Sumi Dhanarajan, will now share some of the insights for the call to action report that you saw in hard copy being launched just now. These are just a sprinkling of the insights in the report, so please do take a look now that it has been so glamorously launched into the world. I should say that these findings are the result of consolidating existing research from respected sources, as well as primary interviews and site visits. We share with the intention to support the renewable energy sector in furthering best practice and collaborating where there are challenges. So as we have heard already, it is imperative that we scale renewable energy generation here in India and across the world in order to meet our climate as well as energy access and security goals. There's just no question it has to happen. You may have seen our friends at CEW's paper released as part of the current discussion on setting a net zero emissions target for India around about 2050. It indicates that we'll need to use the use of non-hydro renewable energy to increase by 55-fold. Even to meet the existing target of 450 gigawatts installed capacity by 2030, that is a 5-fold increase from what we have installed now. And whilst this is a really, really positive and imperative ambition for the sector, it will inevitably result in increasing pressure on resources and the subsequent knock-on effects on the environment and people. For instance, that is roughly 5 times the amount of materials and land needed currently. Materials that we will hear come from high-risk value chains and land that may be used for other purposes currently. We recognize that the impacts we will share are not unique to the renewable energy sector. Many therefore present the opportunity to collaborate with others to achieve greater influence. The Responsible Energy Initiative was established to enable just that, collaboration among actors in the renewable energy system and to tackle the challenges that are too big to tackle alone. India is not alone in this moment of huge scale for the sector, and the initiative will be looking to work in other countries as well. But for now, we're focusing on the particularly large opportunity here to drive a regenerative and just future in India. So why regenerative and just? What exactly do we mean by that? Why are we talking about this instead of sustainability or net zero? We suggest that net zero is just one of the elements actually that we need. A just and regenerative future includes the multiple agendas required to ensure that we operate within planetary boundaries and thrive whilst doing so. Sustainability is about a continuation into the future, minimizing harm and ensuring future generations get to live as we do. But just and regenerative goes beyond continuation. It recognizes the fact that we are now at a point in relation to inequality and ecology in particular to proactively repair and regenerate. So we've set out 4 principles that demonstrate how it sets a new level of ambition. Ensuring that we put back into natural and social systems more than we take out. Recognizing the interconnectedness of all natural systems, as well as the interdependence of planetary health with human health and well-being. Shifting how value is created as well as what is value, so that equity is built into the system, with ensuring the dignity and well-being of all as the goal, and actively building capacity to ensure that ecological and human systems have capacity to adapt, evolve, and thrive in the context of change. So when you look at the report, when you download it after this webinar, you'll see that it covers an overview of the landscape of renewable energy in India, including the investment flows currently as a way of exploring their influence in ESG. A broad understanding of the risks and impacts, some of which have been spoken about already, across the value chains of large-scale solar, on and offshore wind, small hydro, lithium-ion batteries, and hydrogen. It focuses on the impacts currently understood, and we recognize that these will evolve over time. It also shares insights into how the impacts are governed, managed, and mitigated currently, as Gavin mentioned. And it includes a call to collaborate on tangible and transformative solutions for scaling renewable energy in a just and regenerative manner. So that first section on the overview of the landscape is basically a story of growth, both past and expected growth, in terms of installed capacity and demand, as well as the need for finance, some of which we highlight on this slide. Even at the current level of scale, we're already seeing impacts and risks emerge as highlighted by Dr. Mathur. Now is the moment to ensure that this growth drives positive, just, and regenerative outcomes. And Hansika will now highlight some key areas that the renewable energy sector actors will need to consider in doing so. Over to you, Hansika.
Thanks, Anna. Thanks for speaking to the growth of the renewable sector. Speaking about the impacts of the RE sector in India, I think it is important that we begin with an acknowledgement that the sector delivers on a range of benefits beyond emission reductions, like greater opportunities for energy access in remote locations, contributions to agriculture productivity, and green jobs. Yet in many ways, the RE sector's value chains share similarities with other infrastructure sectors and are exposed to the same range of environmental and social risks. With scale and type of deployment that the sector will need to be accountable for, increasing pressure on resources and the knock-on effects on the environment and people will be very, very important to address. Given this background, we felt that it was a useful exercise to draw out the impacts across technologies and use a frame to see them in the Indian context. In this report, we have categorized and analyzed the environmental and social impacts and risks across the value chains for the different RE technologies being deployed in India using the finitude, fragility, and fairness, or the 3F framework. The usefulness of this framework over a traditional ESG lens is that the latter risks treating these categories as independent and mutually exclusive, while in reality, the impacts that might appear insignificant when examined in isolation can become significant as they intersect and compound one another. This framework helps articulate the complex interplay between communities, ecosystem, and social justice. In this report, for each technology, we provide a summary map of key risks and impacts across the 3Fs along the value chain. In these, we focus on the material issues being raised by the sector and civil society experts. And before we go into the maps, a caveat is that while we have tried to be exhaustive, we recognize that additional risks may arise as our understanding on the subject evolves. Next slide, please. So we'll start with the solar, the value chain of the utility scale solar projects. So for utility scale solar, some of the biggest impacts arise due to large scale land acquisition and the resulting land use change. What makes the land aspect even trickier in India is that many areas of land essential to our population and ecosystems are formally classified as wasteland in records. And this is the type of land that most often gets allocated to RE projects. This results in multiple social and environmental risks, some of which include the exacerbation of socioeconomic inequities, increasing ecological stresses on the land and climate, and sometimes a competition with other uses such as food production. Some of the other significant impacts include water intensity of panel operation and maintenance, which both of our keynote speakers kind of addressed in reference to how technology is starting to look at addressing these. There are also broad impacts of mining for things that go into inputs for manufacturing. There are risks related to labor rights and impact of hazardous waste on health and environment due to improper disposal of things like solar panels. Next slide, please. Land-related impacts also feature very significantly for onshore wind energy projects. Even when the actual construction might be limited to a relatively smaller area, the impact of allied activities like construction of the access road ends up covering a much wider area. And wind projects have also been flagged for risk to sensitive biodiversity, like impact on avian biodiversity and disturbance to wildlife because of noise. Next slide, please. So when it comes to offshore wind projects, which is in the next slide, we are yet to significantly take off offshore wind in India. And we have highlighted the potential impacts that might emanate from these based on observations of similar project impacts in other parts of the world. These risks are flagged in the hope that RE sector in India can address them from the very outset. So risks include impacts related to marine ecosystems and fishing livelihoods. And in both offshore and onshore wind, we also have end of life cycle challenges with sometimes wind turbine blades being expensive and hard to recycle, particularly when they might be made of composite material, and thus ending up in landfills. Also, the decommissioning of offshore wind infrastructure at this stage can also have an impact on the marine ecology. Next slide, please. Coming to the small hydropower, or SHP. While it generates employment opportunities in its construction phases, many grassroots organizations have highlighted that they also commit a high OHS risk with tunnel collapses, rock falls, landslides, and tractor accidents, reportedly causing deaths and serious injuries in the sector. With potential impact on water flow, downstream impacts on traditional irrigation systems and livelihoods have also been observed in many instances. There has also been reporting related to downstream silting that negatively impacts aquatic life, including impacts on some fish species in the Western Ghats and the Himalayas, which are the biodiversity hotspots of India. Next slide, please. So coming to storage technologies, focusing on lithium-ion batteries, the mining of cobalt and lithium in particular presents a high risk of child labor, modern slavery, as well as undermining of land and water rights. Now, these are also risks related to battery reusing and recycling. And the vulnerability increases when these activities are performed in the informal sector, as the lithium ion recycling value chain is still at a very nascent stage in India. The contamination of surface and groundwater, along with corresponding risk posed to potable water, is of particular concern for vulnerable communities. And similarly, health risks are particularly heightened for informal workers and local communities. Coming to hydrogen, the impacts will largely depend on the feedstock energy source used to produce it. For gray and to a large extent blue hydrogen, these remain significant concern that the benefits of low emission in use is outweighed by the relatively high emission in production. There are also safety risks associated with handling, moving, and using hydrogen. And then very few strategies exist to guide how to manage the end-of-life equipment from hydrogen fuel cells. And as you will, when you download the report, as you will go through the report, looking at these analysis more closely, you will find stronger linkages and feedback loops between the three Fs. And that is exactly what we're hoping to shine a light on through this report. Next slide, please. Looking at how these impacts are governed in India, governance comes in many forms for the sector, as with a lot of other sectors. Multiple actors play a role in governing the RE sector. Public structures and regulatory mechanisms operate at both national and state levels, and they are the primary means of governance. These mechanisms are also supported by judiciary and by civil society with a long history of advocacy around infrastructure projects. Governance at all levels is helping to ensure increased participation and consideration of social and environmental impacts in RE projects. However, emerging evidence regarding impacts suggests a need to understand how existing governance mechanisms can better support the sector in having just and regenerative impacts. And this will require many changes. For instance, from our research for this report, it became increasingly evident that we need to move to a more cumulative way of doing impact assessment rather than thinking of only what is within the project site boundaries or looking at a particular instance in time of a project's entire life cycle. While India has a number of corporate governance mechanisms that encourage and provide guidance to companies on demonstrating corporate responsibility, none of them are unfortunately being applied specifically to the RE sector to address its environmental and social impact. For instance, the CSR provisions of the Companies Act contain no requirement that RE projects directly address environmental or social impacts emanating from the production or deployment of operations of their business. And on that note, I would like to hand it over to Sumi, who will walk us through responses from the market actors towards these impacts. Thank you.
Thank you, Hansika. So for the reasons Hansika just gave you, it's really important that market actors in the system, the developers, the investors, the financiers, and the procurers take proactive steps to recognize their impacts and address them, whilst we see the evolution of corporate governance mechanisms into this space. In the report, we provide you with a broad sense of how these various actors are responding at the present time, and this is what we found. For renewable energy developers, they have demonstrated a wide range of responses to ESG responsibilities, everything from pure CSR type responses all the way through to specific environmental and human rights policies. It has to be said, though, that we also saw varying degrees of maturity in how these are being approached and implemented and operationalized. The environmental and social management systems that have been introduced, we think have been largely influenced by IFC performance standards. A salient point to note is that currently these various management systems do not typically extend to all parts of the value chain. So manufacturing of solar panels in China, for example, or mineral extraction for battery storage that takes place outside of India is often out of scope. A few investors have demonstrated a deeper level of ESG engagement. And from what we have seen, these are mainly foreign private equity investors. In the report, we have highlighted a couple of examples of evolved approaches, including Eversource Capital's ESG policy and ESG management system, which integrates ESG risk management into the fund's core investment processes. In the main, though, many investors currently take the view that renewable energy as a product in and of itself sufficiently ticks the green box, and therefore do not look further into asking about the accountability on the impacts of production or deployment. And this is something that we would like to see evolve. It's a similar story for sustainable procurement, though some C&I procurers are starting to pay some attention. And one example that we pick up in the report is Apple, which has a supplier clean energy program that expects its suppliers to uphold stringent accountability standards to ensure that all clean energy can be verified, and which requires stringent social and environmental reviews of all supplier clean energy projects. And then finally, the banks and other lenders. We found that in the Indian context, many of them are not yet fully recognizing ESG risks associated with the renewable sector, nor are they building these into loan conditions sufficiently for the scale of the challenge that is ahead of us. All that said, we think that all these actors have a great potential to course correct at this moment and then pioneer the right kinds of approaches that will take us to a just and regenerative future. And I am going to hand back to Anna to talk to us about how we're going to do that.
Thank you. So the research conducted for this report, as you've heard, revealed a renewable energy sector that cannot unfortunately be assumed to be inherently sustainable, despite the key and huge contributions it is making to a low carbon future. A complex mix of factors have been identified that mean that there are still these critical gaps when it comes to the implementation of ESG approaches by the sector. But there is another way to look at this. The renewable energy sector is uniquely poised to pioneer the shift to just and regenerative business models. Because of the renewable energy sector's influence, reach, and mission-led nature, this growth could drive multiple co-benefits far beyond reducing emissions. It could drive the just transition through creating and growing local economies and provide fulfilling jobs and be at the heart of a thriving network of livelihoods. It could pioneer how infrastructure can work with biodiversity and environmental cycles. It could lend its voice and influence to addressing systemic challenges such as human rights abuses in minerals supply chains. In the report, we set out different recommended actions for different actors to drive transformation through the renewable energy sector. There are many things that we can do now. They are set out on a scale of ambition from performer to pioneer, where performer focuses on ensuring good practice in their own operations and relationships. Leader steps ahead of today's good practice, moving the narrative from ESG being the aim to being just the foundation. And where pioneer is driving system level change, addressing assumptions and challenges that have been seemingly locked in. Please do read the report to see those individual recommendations. But more generally, it's really important and quite urgent that two things happen quickly. The sector supporting an ecosystem of actors need to raise their awareness of the importance of looking beyond and beneath the positive credentials associated with the production of low carbon energy. In doing so, they recognize the need to better understand and to address the ESG impacts and risks throughout the value chains, and critically, the opportunities to ensure that any net zero target brings about broad-ranging benefits for India across many development agendas. Some of these challenges and opportunities are far too great and complex to tackle alone. So the second need urgently is that actors must collaborate to map out and take action on mitigating the emerging adverse impacts before they become a risk to the pace of the sector's growth. And the baby, renewable energy, risks being thrown out with the bathwater, which is the environmental and social impacts. So to make sure this doesn't happen, we as a consortium in the Responsible Energy Initiative are inviting ambitious renewable energy companies, investors, financiers, large buyers of renewable energy, and other decision makers and solution providers to join the next phase of the initiative, where we will be building a holistic vision from within the sector of what and how it can contribute to a just and regenerative future. Identify practical actions we can collectively take to make that happen, and to pilot these actions to demonstrate the art of the possible. So if you share our level of ambition and haven't already spoken to us, if we know we've spoken to many of you already, please do contact Saksham on this email address on the slide here. I'll now hand over to Bharat and our esteemed group of panelists to get a little deeper into this opportunity for India. Over to you, Bharat.
Thank you, Anna. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening to all of you. I'm Bharat Jairaj. I lead WRI India's energy program, and I am also associated with the Governance Center at WRI. I have the privilege of moderating this panel over the next 30 minutes. Lots has already been said and shared by speakers before me, but I will restate one point. And that is to keep in mind the number 379 gigawatts. 379 gigawatts is India's total installed capacity as on today. This includes thermal, hydro, nuclear, and renewables. 379 gigawatts. And the commitment we've heard several speakers talk about is that by 2030, our renewable energy installed capacity will be 450 gigawatts. So that's a huge, staggering number to keep in mind, and an important context for us to have at the back of our mind as we go into this panel. Let me now introduce the panelists. We have Tejaswini Kamath, who heads ESG and Impact at Eversource Capital. She has over 14 years of global experience in EHS, social and sustainability services. Prior to Eversource, Tejaswini held leadership positions at ERM and at Stantec. Next, we have Chandrabhushan, who is the founder and CEO of the International Forum for Environment, Sustainability and Technology, or iForest. CB, as we all know him, is an engineer, an environmental planner, and a public policy expert on a wide range of environmental and sustainability issues, from mining and resource extraction to climate change and energy transformation. Our third panelist is Nishant Kumar, who is the Vice President and Head of Quality, Health, Safety and Environment and CDP at INA Renewable Power. The company INA has a portfolio of over 1,000 megawatts of solar PV projects in Andhra Pradesh, Karnataka and Rajasthan, and is a growing company. Our fourth panelist is my colleague Uttara Narayan from WRI India. Uttara is one of the authors of this report, and it will be good to also hear the author's perspective. She holds a master's in development studies from IIT Madras and a master's in public policy from Oxford. At WRI, she uses interdisciplinary approaches to address challenges at the intersection of environment, social justice, and development. Before I turn to the panel, a request to all of you, if you have questions for the panel, please use the Q&A option, which is at the bottom of your screens. So let me start by posing the sort of first question to Uttara. We've seen the team just present an overview of the report, and the report covers a wide range of small and large impacts. We've heard about the reduced access to land for vulnerable groups, issues of fragmentation of forests, loss of wildlife habitats, cumulative impacts on the environment, and so on. So the opening question really is, are all these impacts specific to the RE sector? Are these specific to specific RE technologies? Or are these impacts that we should expect that come with any large infrastructure project? And really thinking about, do you have a framework to capture these different types of impacts and the scale of these impacts?
Well, thank you, Bharat. Hello, everyone. So while it is important to acknowledge that not all the negative impacts are unique to the RE sector and are comparable to conventional large infrastructure projects in general, the issue is complicated in the case of renewables, given the relatively benign perception it enjoys, especially when it comes to clearances and approvals. Therefore, the intensity of many of these impacts that you mentioned, that some of the speakers before also spoke about in terms of land use, displacement, water extraction, cultural capital as well, and so on, is actually quite unclear. Added to that, despite the resource intensity, and we have some evidence around land and water because they're more tangible impacts, many of these projects continue to be situated in fragile ecosystems such as desert and semi-arid lands. And many of these landscapes are also habitats of marginalized communities like nomadic pastoralists. So when we talk about social impacts around gender and caste, while the overarching consequences may be similar and comparable, how they play out in terms of displacement, restricted access to the resources and so on is contextual to the social dynamics at these sites. And let us also not forget the politics of co-benefits, such as job creation that the energy transition promises, especially at these sites. And that is why this will sort of play out differently in the context of the RE transition versus other historic large infrastructure interventions. So therefore, in the report, we also have specific case studies that bring out these local insights to complement the broader impacts. Then you also mentioned the technology piece, right? So there are also technology specific nuances that we must be aware of. And as also Hansika presented, so for example, say land around installations is relatively more accessible in a wind farm versus the way many utility scale solar parks are designed. So the land, how the land use changes, hence distinguished accordingly. So therefore, in the report, we have qualitatively identified the impacts across the life cycle of key RE technologies, ranging from human impacts. I emphasize qualitatively because of the varied characteristics of these impacts that range from degradation of ecosystem services and values to discounting of indigenous cultural capital, which is not yet something that can be sort of rationally captured as yet, or we haven't found frameworks to do that. So the first step that we have is that we have at least tried to acknowledge the variety of the impacts that are present, and also acknowledge that these are cumulative and they emanate across space and time through the project life cycle. So yeah, because these impacts also get accumulated across and beyond the project life cycle. So through our framing of capturing technology specific impacts, we hope to present the diverse, dynamic, and complex nature of these impacts while acknowledging and simultaneously learning from the consequences of other large infrastructure.
Thanks. So building from that, in this space for a very long time, you've written and spoken about. I wanted to sort of ask you, have you seen what sort of response have you seen from the RE sector? And I don't mean just the companies, but also the government stakeholders who are tasked with environment and social protection and such. So over to you, Steve.
Thank you, Bharat. First of all, congratulations to Forum for the Future, WRI, and other partners for bringing out this excellent report. Bharat, I think we will have to look at RE sector as not as one monolithic sector, but like any other sector, there are different subdivisions in RE. And from ecological perspective, those subdivisions are very important to consider. And broadly, I think that we can divide RE sector into three parts from ecological and environmental perspective. The first is RE sector where site itself has deep ecological issues. And that's where wind and hydro will come. Then you have RE sector, which is more infrastructure related, where the environmental management challenges are similar to other infrastructure projects. And there you will have hydrogen, especially from the perspective of pipelines, and solar from the perspective of large solar. And in between now, you have biomass and essentially biofuel. And also if you are producing hydrogen from biomass, then that's the second where resource intensity is very high, both from land as well as water. Of course, solar also is a broadly resource intensive. The only difference being that biomass needs fertile land, whereas you can have solar on less fertile agricultural land, as well as on many
CV, we seem to have lost you. Okay, we'll just move on then and come back to CV at the next round. But Tejaswini, let me come to you. What is, you as an investor, what is your experience been? What has worked and could work in influencing good or pioneering ESG practices with the companies you work with?
Sure. Thanks, Bharat, and hello, everyone. And congratulations to the Forum for the Future team. It's been amazing to work with them, and it's an excellent report. I would request everybody to download the report and go through it. It's an amazing piece of work that they've pulled together. So Bharat, coming to your question, yeah, so, I would categorize, three main areas, which essentially would be the success factors, for pioneering ESG, as you had asked. So firstly is, really looking at this entire piece of investment, not separate, from ESG. ESG has to be an enabler, in terms of decision making right from the very beginning. So we are really looking at divergence versus convergence. So integrating ESG across the investment life cycle and really using ESG risks as opportunities to take the project to a different scale altogether. So I think that's the shift, if investors are able to make right from the very beginning, that's really going to make a big difference. Second is really having a strong commitment, and I would say rather a visible commitment from the management when it comes to ESG, because ultimately, as is the case in any other company, if the management really walks the talk, it really trickles down and percolates down to the portfolio companies. So I believe for us, that is really being one of the strongest factors which is worked in translating some of the successes at the portfolio companies. So, what it really means is, having dedicated set of ESG resources, not really, having somebody from maintenance or procurement to take up, additional responsibilities of ESG, but really identifying ESG as important as a key function as is finance, as is legal, giving its, due position at the leadership level as well. And importantly, also allocating adequate budget, as far as ESG initiatives are concerned, right? And thirdly, I would say, for any investor, it's very important. And I know sometimes it can become, tricky if you are a minority shareholder in a company, but really, partnering with the developers and the companies, to ensure that there is continual development, which is, rarely, just beyond compliance monitoring, conducting due diligence and, conducting frequent audits, following up on the action plan, but really going that extra mile, and also focusing on the positive impacts. I believe today, when we talk about the entire landscape of impact investing, clearly the investors are moving beyond the negative screening, so to say, of ESG, and they are looking at, the positive impacts in terms of, how is a company aligning with the core sustainable development goals? How are they performing as per that? So really, I would say that, these would broadly be the three buckets, that could sort of render pioneering ESG in investor community.
Great. Thanks, Tejaswini. Nishant, before I come to you, let me just go back to Chandrabhushan, and we lost you for a bit. So yeah. My question was, have you seen, what is the responses you've seen from the private sector and from government? And you
as I started by saying, Bharat, that I think we will have to divide RE into three segments from an environmental, ecological, and social perspective, and also from governance perspective, because your governance framework will depend on what kind of environmental and social impact we are looking at. Now, let's look at infrastructure projects like solar, for example, or the pipeline and infrastructure we will have to set up for hydrogen. Now, all the infrastructure related issues are here. The only difference here is, and I think that there is a lot of solutions we have on solar. Just to give you an example, we have about 500,000 hectare, or maybe about 700,000 million hectare of land, which will be available in mining areas. Okay, maybe 500,000 hectare of land, which is going to be mining waste land. We have about 1,000,000 hectare of land under dams, water bodies. And then you have, for example, buildings where solar can come. So I am not as bothered from land perspective of solar if we get our solar policy right. Today also, I mean to say, if you take a map of India and look at the largest solar potential and the land potential of area, you will find that the highest solar potential is where you have quote unquote unproductive land. I understand the issue of community access of land, which is very important. I understand there is an issue with wasteland classification, but nevertheless, if we are looking at from productivity point of view, then solar is likely to come in areas where you have less productive land. So I think land issue is manageable as far as solar is concerned. I think the big problem is with hydro and wind, where there are deep ecological issue and where the governance system also is very weak. We do not have any environmental impact assessment for wind or a small hydro. And I do not think that we need to differentiate between a small hydro and big hydro. Our experience has been that 10 small hydro might have much bigger ecological impact than one big hydro. So I think this is a very Indian definition of saying small is good and big is bad, and a small is renewable and big is not scientifically valid argument here. Now, from my perspective, you are absolutely right. Green energy comes with a green tag, and therefore there's less pressure on them. But I think it is important now to start thinking about governance mechanism for green, but it has to be nuanced. You do not want, I do not want, frankly speaking, an environmental impact assessment to come into the green sector. Okay, we have seen the value of environmental impact assessment in other sectors. And the second issue I would like to mention here is that we need to think about ESG governance mechanism within companies, as well as no-go area for some of the renewable energy projects. Wind, for example, there was already a discussion in 2015, 2014 to have a no-go area. Similarly, no-go area for small hydro will work. So I think let's have a much nuanced picture on ESG, both from what companies can do and what governance needs to do, rather than take the failed model we have seen in the past of government regulation of environmental impact assessment and all kind of clearances, which doesn't work, and neither does it incentivizes companies to do better. So I think we will have to have a very different approach for renewable energy, considering the scale that we are looking at, than what we have done in the past.
So let me take that point straight to Nishant. Nishant, you work with a growing renewable energy company. Can you tell us, in your experience, what has helped or what can help a company like yours, but also other renewable energy companies, adding the nuances and caveats that CB just introduced? So how, what has helped or can help renewable energy companies look across the value chain, across the supply chain, to better understand and respond to the concerns that we have been discussing and which have come up in this report?
Yeah, thanks Bharat and everyone. I think the report is really good and realistic, and whatever we are discussing here is,
Sir, can you speak up? We are not able to hear you too well.
Okay. So thanks everyone, and the report looks very realistic. Am I audible?
Yes, yes.
Yeah. See, we need to get back to that few years when the renewable energy sector started in this country, and government started promoting the sector, and because of that, a lot of regulations and other things were diluted or made not applicable for the sector, just to promote the sector. So that is one where you find few organizations taking that as an opportunity. But at the same time, what has happened in the past, that there are a lot of foreign investors, foreign investment, globalization is there, a lot of civil society activities are there, which has made the sector to look into the ESG matter. Okay, and now there's few companies who may not be much focused, but there are several organizations who are focused and which integrated these management systems. So say, for example, if EIA is not a requirement or environment clearance is not a requirement, but still there are organizations who do it voluntarily, like they do complete environmental and social impact assessment, and they are integrating all these ESG factors. Globalization and information has also helped us in getting views or global concern, considering those concerns in the business. And now we are capturing that as well. Like if you're speaking about the supply chain issues and other things, now it is in mind of the investor, it is in mind of the developer. Yes, these are issues and we should be managing these issues or impacts proactively. Other than that, we always speak about the IFC performance standard, ISO certification and other things. And now the new thing has come is the SDG, where obviously renewable energy sector is contributing in clean energy and affordable green energy. But again, few of the other indicators can be picked from it. And this is going to help. Even the business model of the sector is changing. It's not just that we are generating energy and we are selling it, but it's all about giving back to society and other things. So a lot of things have come up, though these are not mandatory or regulatory requirements, but these things are pushing the sector towards adopting and practicing the best practices in the ESG sector.
So Nishant, if I can just ask you a sort of follow-up. So are there, I mean, you've worked, before you came to the renewable energy space, you worked in several other sectors. And, given your wide experience in other sectors, would you say, that there are things that the renewable energy industry can learn from the pathways and the efforts made and the lessons learned in any other sector or any other sectors? And if so, what would those be?
Definitely, I'll pick a few sectors or I'll compare those sectors which originated in somewhere in 1982, 85, and few of them were like greatest invention of mankind, and no one thought that those sectors will be cornered. One sector is thermal sector. Okay, so in 1982, the first thermal public power plant was constructed in UK, and that was the greatest invention of the time. No one would have thought that this sector may get pushed. And somewhere around 1985, product was launched, that is Coca-Cola. Okay. Now there is a basic difference where the energy is a need. The product of Coke is a desire. You may use it, you may not use it. But if you look into the integration of ESG matters or how they thought, like thermal sector, it got cornered because it was focused on the footprint. It did not capture its supply chain, like right from the mining to other issues to the pollution, and which was beyond the plant. Okay, and then people started thinking of alternative source of energy, and this is how renewable energy came in. And if you get back to the sector, renewable energy sector, when it came in India, at that time, again, it was not competitive. When we compare it with thermal in terms of tariff, in terms of generation and other things. But today, within 10 years, the scenario has completely changed. Okay. So now, and if you look at the other sector, that is Coke, which is a desired based product, if you see they have integrated the ESG matter into their business right from the beginning. If you look into their product, and it is not only the footprint, they are going beyond. Like they are water-based organization, so they are trying to neutralize the water consumption. They are going outside their organization for rainwater harvesting. They try to neutralize it. They try to minimize the waste generation from the packaging material. They try to get into RE, contribute into RE. So a lot of things they are looking beyond this company specific issues, and they are trying to mitigate that. That was not with the thermal. And now if you're looking in the broader sense, that same thermal thing is also getting associated with the renewable energy sector. If you look at the supply chain, now the biggest challenge is the raw material sourcing. When we look at the mining and other things, because now we are looking at renewable energy sector just as a clean and green energy and a localized impact thing which can be easily managed and is not significant. But if we look at the supply chain, everyone spoke about that. And it's time, and it's the right time to think on those issues and mitigate those issues. If we need to survive, the sector needs to grow further.
So Tejaswini, let me come back to you and ask you as an investor, what challenges do you face in pushing RE companies towards more ESG?
Sure, Bharat. And, I would say that, again, as, Uttara had mentioned, one set of challenge is really the overarching challenge, which is, irrespective of the sector of renewable energy, it poses globally and is also relevant either, at the country level or the regional level, right? So, globally, we've seen climate crisis, we've seen economic inequality, gender disparity, racial injustice. These have really posed, or rather I would say have really surfaced a lot at the start of this decade. And we all know that COVID-19 pandemic has really devastated and disrupted lives of several people around the world, and it has made even harder to achieve the sustainable development goal target, because the focus of government has now shifted really to new levels of debt to survive the threats of this disease, rather than focusing on how can we make the entire sector or any other focus sector much better in terms of their operations. So broadly, these are, I would say, some of the overarching challenges that will prevail in any sector, and we'll have to really deal with it. Coming specifically to our projects, or to the site specific challenges, clearly there are examples around wherein gender is one of our focus areas, gender mainstreaming. But Nishant and I were talking the other day, and we clearly know that it is just impossible to get women to work at the solar plants, right? Because it's a cultural issue. And how do we deal with it? It's a sensitive issue as well, right? So apart from just hiring women at the site, what else can we do to empower the overall safety of the community, wherein women can thrive safely, right? So those are the other areas that are challenging, but we are trying to figure out ways as to how it can be worked. The other challenge, I would say, that Gavin brought up in his note was around the China's child labor issue, which is recently propped up because of the solar panels, wherein child labor is involved. And I think 50% of the polysilicon material has been sourced from China. So it is not that easy to completely shut down, the value chain and then suddenly just say that now India starts manufacturing it. It has to be phased out, right? And so these are some of the aspects that we need to keep in mind as we move forward. Even for example, rooftop solar, like CB mentioned, the issues of land may not prevail in rooftop, but clearly, there are issues around the safety of workers, because the workers coming from the informal sector, they've become so complacent. So despite providing them the safety infrastructure, providing them trainings, doing refresher trainings, having a supervisor there are still incidents wherein they do fall down, right? Because they are complacent. So these are some of the, I would say, challenges where on ground reality really needs to marry with the finitude of what really we have at the strategy level. Of course there are solutions, and I think collaborations like Forum for the Future and other such initiatives that Dr. Mathur mentioned in the beginning, having a country level sort of a coalition will definitely help.
So CB, let me quickly ask you, I'm aware that we're quickly running out of time, but just building on what you said earlier, do you think, do you think are the systems and mechanisms we have in place today, are they adequate to address the kinds of challenges that we're discussing? Do we need new ones?
So I think, Bharat, we need to build on what we have and then identify gaps that we need to fill in. I very strongly believe that we have legal mechanism to deal with critical environmental and social and governance issue in RE sector. For example, battery management rules. We need to strengthen battery management rules if storage is going to become a big part of our energy game plan going ahead in the future. So let's strengthen battery management rule and extended producers responsibility mechanism in battery management rule. Similarly, let's look at electronic waste. solar panel recycling. We already have e-waste rule. Of course, it is being implemented very, very poorly. EPR is not being followed there as well. So let's strengthen EPR mechanism and electronic waste rule to look at recycling and other issues with solar. Uh, Under our Environmental Protection Act, as I said, we have provision for go, no-go area. Think about critical ecosystem where you do not want projects of wind and hydro to come, and certain solar project. Well, the likelihood of solar project coming in deep ecological area is less, but still you can think about a no-go area for certain solar projects. So that's one part of the work we need to do in terms of strengthening what we have. Now, the gaps that are there are two ways to do it. One is to advocate to the government to bring new rules for renewable energy. I frankly am not a promoter of new regulation coming in, because more and more regulation you have more and more uh, bureaucratic hurdles, and the kind of impediment that will impact the renewable energy sector. Our time frame for climate change is very short. Keep that in mind. And therefore, you do not want a system which will delay everything just because a Babu needs a paper signature. Okay, let me be as blunt as that. And there, I think the gaps can be filled by having internal processes within the renewable energy company, making them more accountable and transparent. I very much like the idea of voluntary environmental impact assessment rather than a mandatory environmental assessment. A voluntary EIA process where the companies are going to put it out in the public domain. So a covenant, a renewable energy company can come together, build a covenant, come out with their own self-governance mechanism. I like that. I do not like a system which has failed in the past. I'm reiterating it, but it is important for all of us to understand what has not worked in the past. Let's not promote something which is going to even impede this sector. Let me finish at that.
Great, thank you, CB. Uttara, just quickly to you, we've heard about ESG. We've heard now from Chandrabhushan what else needs to be done in terms of gaps and so on. Do you think that these systems are enough, ESG and this almost ESG plus kind of thing? Or what's your take on that?
So it should definitely be ESG plus, because I think it's encouraging but insufficient, and I would say the same about voluntary actions as well, right? Because there are multiple incentives and there's a larger political economy at play. So I would actually, while I accept CB's skepticism around bureaucratic procedures, and the need to bring in more nuance into the governance processes, I still think that apart from that, there are other public instruments of action that we need to sort of creatively think about. And hence this is also an opportunity to think a little more expansively about the factors that inform the current ESG framework. And also expand our stakeholder base, right? So what do we even mean by public? So it's not just government institutional mechanisms that we need to look at, right? So, and more fundamentally, we might also need to embed principles of justice more prominently within this existing governance framework. One useful framing is that we can consider is this thing around justice risks, which has been conceptualized by Raphael Heffron and others, which actually goes beyond the traditional commercial risks that are considered by the investment community. And very briefly, these risks actually account for various dimensions of justice, which we also want, which various stakeholders of this who represent the renewable energy sector actually want to embed in. Around distributive, procedural, restorative recognition, and even cosmopolitan justice. And I'm bringing this especially because of the transnational risks that Tejaswini mentioned, right? And this is something that we need to be able to embed across the project lifecycle and urge project developers to account for when they're actually calculating the project cost and so on. And this framing is also something that's more equitable and inclusive and is able to capture the sort of various risks that sort of pop up across the project lifespan. So that's one way in which we can creatively look at it. And secondly, I think, when we say public action around accountability and governance, yes, we need to think more creatively about what that collective action looks like beyond sort of conventional notions of how we look at the bureaucratic institutions. And the next phase of the Renewable Energy Initiative, which is the inquiry phase, there we will sort of get into greater details on actually envisioning what this just and regenerative RE transition will look like for a more inclusive conversation towards collective action in this sector.
Great. Thanks. And I apologize to those of you who asked questions. We are desperately running out of time. I want to thank all the panelists. This was, we're just sort of scratching the surface, and I think, there's lots more to be gone into. But as Uttara ended, as we think of the next phase of this effort, we're looking to all of you to as experts who will join us. So thank you all, and now I'm going to pass this on to Pinaki from Landesa to close the event. Pinaki, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Bharat, for facilitating this wonderful panel discussion. Now I would like first to invite Cheryl to deliver the closing remarks. And let me introduce Cheryl also. She is the Director of Corporate Responsibility and Sustainability for Asia Pacific at the S&P Global. She leads the efforts in the region with the S&P Global Foundation grant initiatives and partnerships, employee volunteerism, and corporate ESG practices. Over to Cheryl.
Thank you, Pinaki. Really glad to be part of the launch of the Responsible Energy Initiative and the Case for Action report today. The S&P Global Foundation is proud to be a key sponsor of this work as we seek to promote a more sustainable environment as one of our key focus areas. As we all know, the scaling of renewable energy is absolutely essential in the transition, an urgent transition to a low carbon future. However, as shared in the Case for Action report, you have heard from all the esteemed researchers and panelists today, the positive environmental outcomes of clean energy in the RE sector is much appreciated. However, there's a range of environmental and social risks and impact across the value chain, which is lesser known, but equally critical to be understood and mitigated. Hence, S&P Global Foundation is glad to be a multi-year supporter of this initiative that Forum for the Future has established in collaboration with WRI India, the Energy and Resources Institute, or TERI, Landesa, and WWF India. I think they've only stopped short of saying Avengers Assemble. It has been an extensive and very, very impressive teamwork over the last 1 year with a shared passion and belief in the Responsible Energy Initiative. So I'd really like to thank the partners that made this possible, the leaders, as well as the researchers and the colleagues at Forum, WRI, TERI, WWF, Landesa, and of course, the FCDO for the strong support and faith in this initiative. We believe that this is a critical topic amidst the global and regional efforts in catalyzing more informed climate action and for RE to fulfill its full potential and promise as a key enabler in India and globally to a sustainable future. This Case for Action report that we launched today with all of you is the first step, but an important first step to inform the multi-year stakeholder inquiry, which will happen next. So if you are a stakeholder in any part of the value chain, an investor, developer, buyer, regulator, we really invite you to participate in the stakeholder inquiry and conversation. If you're keen on supporting and funding this initiative and inquiry itself as a philanthropic organization or corporate organization, we really welcome you to join us to advocate and build a socially just and regenerative RE sector together. So thank you once again, and I'll now hand the virtual mic over to Pinaki for the vote of thanks.
Thank you, Cheryl, for your inspiring words. I would now first like to thank the eminent speakers, Gavin Magivillari and Dr. Ajay Mathur. We are grateful that you would launch the report and share your ambition. Thank you so much. I would also like to thank the panelists for sharing your experiences and insights during the discussion. Tejaswini Kamat, Eversource Capital, Chandra Bhushan from iForest, Nishant Kumar, Aina Renewable Power, Uttara Narayan, of course, from WRI India, and finally, Bharat Jairaj for wonderful facilitation, again from WRI India for moderating the discussion. Now it's evident from the observations of the report and from the various perspectives shared today that growth of the RE sector is important to drive a low carbon future, and at the same time that it is not inherently sustainable and still evolving when it comes to implementation of ESG approaches. A robust approach is urgent and necessary to address these emerging critical impacts, some of which were discussed today, particularly around land use change, water use, biodiversity, energy industries, and labor and human rights abuses. We would like to acknowledge that while most of these impacts are not exclusive to the RE sector, there is an opportunity to lead pioneering collaborative action. That is the underlined point. This report is the outcome of just the first stage of the renewable energy to responsible energy initiative. We are looking for pioneering organizations to join this collaborative effort to collectively address the challenges and opportunities discussed today. If you are interested in joining the initiative, most welcome. Reach out to Saksham. Please do download the report and take a look at the more detailed findings. That will be very, very helpful, I can assure. And to all of you in the audience thank you so much for taking time to join this conversation. If you have any thoughts you want to share with us, please do reach out. Thank you so much.